I was lying on my back in Dashiell's apartment, staring at the water stain on his ceiling that looked like a cloud, when he asked me what I was thinking about. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday, and we'd been friends for 8 months, co-workers for almost a year, and I'd been in love with him for at least 6 of those months without saying a single word about it. The truth was, I was thinking about the way his hand had brushed against mine when he passed me the bottle of wine earlier. I was thinking about how his laugh sounded different when it was just the two of us, quieter and more genuine. I was thinking about the fact that I'd started making excuses to stay late at the office just so we could walk to the parking garage together. But I couldn't tell him any of that, so I said I was thinking about work, which was probably the most unconvincing lie I'd ever told. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he shifted on the couch, turning to look at me where I was sprawled on the floor with a throw pillow under my head. The TV was playing some movie neither of us was watching, casting blue light across his living room. We'd done this dozens of times before, these late nights that started as casual hangouts and stretched until dawn, but something felt different tonight. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name or maybe didn't want to name. Let me back up. I should probably explain how I got here. Lying on Dashiell's floor at 2 a.m, pretending not to be completely gone for him. It started in February, my first day at the marketing firm downtown. I was 26, fresh from a breakup with a woman I'd been dating for 3 years, trying to convince myself I was fine when I definitely wasn't. The relationship had ended because she said I seemed distant, like I was always somewhere else in my head, and she wasn't wrong. I'd spent most of that relationship feeling like I was performing the role of boyfriend rather than actually being one. But I chalked it up to stress or compatibility issues or anything except the truth I wasn't ready to examine. Dashiell was assigned to show me around the office. He worked in the design department, and I was in copywriting, but our desks were close enough that we'd end up collaborating on projects. The first thing I noticed about him was his eyes, this unusual grey-green colour that reminded me of the ocean before a storm. The second thing I noticed was his hands, the way they moved when he talked, like he was sculpting his words in the air. He had this energy about him, this quiet intensity that drew people in without him seeming to try. He was explaining the coffee machine in the break room, something about how you had to hold the button down for exactly 3 seconds or it would overflow, and I was nodding along while internally wondering why I couldn't stop staring at the way his hair fell across his forehead. It was dark brown, almost black, and he kept pushing it back in this absent gesture that I would come to recognise as something he did when he was concentrating. We became friends easily, naturally. He'd stop by my desk with questions about copy. I'd wander over to his with ideas for layouts. We started having lunch together most days, usually at this Vietnamese place 2 blocks from the office, where they knew our orders by heart. He always got the po with rare beef, and I always got the banh mi with extra pickled vegetables, and we'd split an order of spring rolls down the middle. It was during one of these lunches, maybe 6 weeks after I started, that he mentioned he was gay. Not in a dramatic way, just casually, talking about his ex-boyfriend who'd moved to Portland for a job. I remember the exact moment he said it, because I felt something shift in my chest, like a door opening that I hadn't known was there. I nodded and made some sympathetic comment about long distance being tough, and then I went back to my sandwich while my brain quietly spiraled. I'd never seriously questioned my sexuality before. Sure, there'd been moments in college, passing thoughts about certain guys that I'd dismissed as admiration or aesthetic appreciation. There was my roommate sophomore year who I'd been weirdly jealous about when he got a girlfriend, but I'd convinced myself I was just upset about losing my gaming buddy. There was the bartender at our regular spot senior year who I'd maybe thought about more than was strictly normal, but I'd written that off as wanting to be him, not wanting him. But sitting across from Dashiell in that Vietnamese restaurant, watching him wrap a spring roll in lettuce with those careful hands, I couldn't dismiss what I was feeling. It wasn't just that I liked spending time with him, it was that I thought about him constantly when we weren't together. It was that I felt more alive in his presence than I had in years. It was that I'd started to notice things about men I'd never let myself notice before, and it all seemed to spiral back to him. I spent the next month in complete denial. I threw myself into work, went on a few dates with women from apps, tried to recreate whatever I'd had with my ex. But every date felt hollow. I'd be sitting across from someone perfectly nice, perfectly attractive, and all I could think about was whether Dashiell had finished that project he'd been stressing about, or if he'd tried that new coffee shop he'd mentioned wanting to check out. The denial cracked on a Tuesday in late April. We were working late on a campaign that was due the next morning, just the two of us in the office. It was around 9 and we'd ordered pizza and Dashiell had tomato sauce on his cheek from eating too fast. Without thinking, I reached across the table and wiped it off with my thumb. It was such a simple gesture, something you'd do for any friend, but the moment my skin touched his, I felt it everywhere. He'd frozen, looking at me with those storm-coloured eyes, and I'd pulled back so fast I nearly knocked over my soda. We didn't talk about it. We just went back to work, but I couldn't concentrate anymore. Every cell in my body was aware of him sitting 3 feet away, the sound of his breathing, the way he chewed on his pen when he was thinking. When we finally finished around midnight, we were the last ones in the building. We walked to the parking garage together, and the whole time I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. That night, I lay in bed and finally let myself think it. I'm attracted to him. I'm attracted to men. I might be gay or bisexual or something I don't have a word for yet. But whatever I am, I'm definitely not straight. The realization should have felt catastrophic, but instead, it felt like finally setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for years. The next few months were a strange kind of torture. I was figuring out my sexuality while simultaneously falling deeper for someone I couldn't have. Dashiell was my friend, my best friend really, and I couldn't risk losing that by confessing feelings he might not return. Plus, I was still so new to all of this. How could I tell him I had feelings for him when I was barely beginning to understand those feelings myself? But we kept getting closer. Our lunch hangouts turned into dinner hangouts, turned into weekend hangouts. I met his friends, he met mine. We developed 1,000 tiny inside jokes and rituals. He'd text me photos of funny signs he saw on his way to work. I'd send him terrible puns that made him groan. We had a running competition to find the worst movie on streaming services, and we'd force each other to watch our discoveries. One Saturday in July, we went hiking at this state park an hour outside the city. It was brutally hot, the kind of day where the air feels thick enough to swim through. We'd been climbing this trail for 2 hours and I was dying, but Dashiell looked completely unbothered, like he could hike forever. We reached this overlook where you could see the entire valley spread out below, all green and gold in the summer light, and he turned to me with this huge smile and said this was exactly what he needed. I asked him what he meant and he got quiet for a moment, looking out at the view. Then he said he'd been feeling stuck lately, like he was going through the motions of his life without really living it. He said being out here, doing something real with someone he cared about, made him remember what it felt like to be present. And then he looked at me and said he was grateful for our friendship, that I'd made the last few months better than he'd expected when the year started. I should have told him then. We were standing on a mountain with the world spread out at our feet, and he was basically handing me an opening, but I couldn't make the words come. Instead, I said something generic about being grateful too, and we hiked back down in comfortable silence while I mentally kicked myself the entire way. By September, the tension was killing me. I'd started seeing a therapist, partly to deal with my sexuality crisis, and partly because I needed someone to talk to about Dashiell before I exploded. Her name was Dr. Chen, and she was incredibly patient with my rambling sessions where I'd spend 50 minutes trying to analyse every tiny interaction. She asked me what I was afraid of. I said I was afraid of losing him, of making things weird, of not being enough, of being too much. I was afraid that if I told him our friendship would implode, and I'd lose the best thing in my life. But I was also afraid that if I didn't tell him, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Dr. Chen pointed out that I was already in pain, that hiding my feelings was its own kind of loss. She asked if I'd considered that Dashiell might feel the same way, and I laughed because that seemed impossible. He was confident and creative and could probably have anyone he wanted. Why would he want me, someone who'd just figured out his sexuality a few months ago, and was still stumbling through understanding it? But then she asked me something that stuck. She said, "Do you trust him?" And I realised I did, completely. I trusted Dashiell more than I'd trusted anyone in years. If I told him and he didn't feel the same way, I knew he'd be kind about it. He wouldn't make me feel stupid or wrong. He might even help me through it. That realisation didn't make me brave enough to confess, but it made me stop pulling away. I'd been creating little distances between us, trying to protect myself, but I stopped doing that. I let myself enjoy our friendship fully, even if it hurt sometimes. I let myself notice the way he looked in morning light during our weekend breakfast hangs. I let myself feel the warmth that spread through my chest when he laughed at my jokes. I stopped fighting what I felt and just let it exist. Which brings me back to tonight, to me lying on his floor at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling. We'd gotten dinner at our usual Vietnamese place, then came back to his apartment to watch a movie. We'd opened a bottle of wine, then another, and somewhere around midnight, I'd migrated from the couch to the floor because his couch was this vintage thing he'd found at an estate sale that looked great but felt like sitting on rocks. He'd thrown me a pillow without me asking, which was such a small thing but felt significant in the way small things between us always did. The movie had ended, but neither of us moved to turn off the TV. We just lay there in the blue glow, talking about nothing and everything. He told me about his sister's wedding coming up in December, how he was stressed about being the best man. I told him about my mom calling to ask when I was going to get back into dating, and how I'd deflected the question like I always did. Then there was this pause, this stretch of silence that felt different from our usual comfortable quiet, and that's when he asked what I was thinking about. I could feel him looking at me, waiting for a real answer. The lie about work hung in the air between us, obvious and insufficient. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. This was it, I realized. This was the moment I'd been avoiding and hoping for in equal measure. I sat up slowly, turning to face him. He was still on the couch, his head resting on the armrest, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The light from the TV caught his eyes, making them look more green than grey. I told him I wasn't really thinking about work. I was thinking about us, about how much my life had changed since I met him. I was thinking about how I looked forward to Monday mornings, because it meant I'd see him. I was thinking about how he was the first person I wanted to tell when anything happened, good or bad. I was thinking about how I'd been lying to myself for months, maybe years, and I was tired of it. He sat up too, and I could see his chest rising and falling faster, like his breathing had changed. He asked me what I meant, and his voice was quiet, careful. I took a breath and told him the truth. I told him I'd spent most of my life not understanding myself, going through relationships that felt like wearing someone else's clothes, always slightly wrong and uncomfortable. I told him that meeting him had cracked something open in me, made me face things I'd been avoiding. I told him I'd figured out I wasn't straight, that I'd been working through what that meant with a therapist and in my own head, and that through all of it, every realization and revelation, he'd been at the center. I told him I was in love with him, that I'd been in love with him for months, maybe from the beginning in some way I hadn't recognized, that I understood if he didn't feel the same way, and I didn't want to lose our friendship, but I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep lying on his floor at 2 a.m, pretending I wasn't completely gone for him. The silence after I finished felt eternal. I couldn't look at him, so I stared at my hands, watching my fingers twist together in my lap. I was preparing myself for gentle rejection, for the careful conversation about staying friends, for the slow, awkward fade of our closeness. Then he said my name, and something in his voice made me look up. His eyes were bright and he was smiling, this small, almost disbelieving smile that I'd never seen before. He told me he'd been waiting for me to figure it out. He said he'd noticed me noticing him months ago, the way I looked at him when I thought he wasn't paying attention. He said he'd realized he had feelings for me around the same time, but he could tell I was working through something and he didn't want to push. He said he'd been trying to be patient, to be a good friend, to give me space to understand myself, but it had been killing him too. He said he'd been hoping, every time we hung out, that I'd say something. He said he'd almost said something himself a dozen times, but always chickened out. He said when I reached across the table that night in April and touched his face, he'd gone home and couldn't sleep because all he could think about was what it would feel like if I did it again, if I meant it the way he wanted me to mean it. I asked him if he was saying what I thought he was saying, because I needed to hear it clearly, needed to not misunderstand. And he moved from the couch to the floor next to me, close enough that our knees were touching, and he said yes. He had feelings for me. He was in love with me too. He had been for a while. I don't remember which of us moved first. Maybe we both did. But suddenly we were kissing, and it was nothing like any kiss I'd had before. It felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff at the same time. His hand was on the back of my neck and mine was on his waist, and we were both smiling too much for it to be a proper kiss, but neither of us cared. When we finally pulled apart, we were both laughing. This giddy, breathless laughter that comes from relief and joy and disbelief all mixed together. He pressed his forehead against mine, and I could feel him shaking slightly, or maybe that was me, or maybe it was both of us. We stayed on that floor until the sun started coming up, talking about everything we'd been holding back. He told me about all the times he'd wanted to reach for my hand and hadn't. I told him about the dreams I'd been having that I'd been too embarrassed to acknowledge. We talked about what this meant, what we wanted, how we'd navigate this shift from friendship to something more. He asked if I was scared, and I said yes, but not of being with him. I was scared of being new at this, of not knowing what I was doing, of somehow messing it up. He said he was scared too, that every relationship was scary when you cared this much, but we'd figure it out together. He said we'd already been figuring things out together for months. This was just the next step. As the room got lighter, I realized the water stain on his ceiling didn't look like a cloud anymore. It looked like wings. Or maybe I was just seeing things differently now that everything had changed. Dashiell caught me staring at it again and asked what I was thinking about this time. I told him the truth. I was thinking about how grateful I was that he'd asked me that question. I was thinking about how different my life looked now compared to an hour ago. I was thinking about how I'd spent so long being afraid of this moment, and now that it was here, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He kissed me again, softer this time, and said we should probably get some sleep, but neither of us moved. We just stayed there on his floor, my head on his shoulder, his arm around me, watching the sunrise paint his apartment in shades of gold and pink. I'd spent months lying on this floor, staring at that ceiling, keeping my feelings locked away. And all it took was one question, one moment of courage to change everything. I'd been so afraid of losing him that I'd almost lost the chance to have this, to have us. Now, lying here with him, I understood something I hadn't before. Love isn't about having all the answers or knowing exactly who you are before you begin. It's about being brave enough to be honest, to be vulnerable, to let someone see you completely. It's about trusting that the right person will meet you where you are, confusion and all, and help you find your way. Dashiell shifted slightly, tightening his arm around me, and I felt him press a kiss to the top of my head. In a few hours, we'd have to face the world, figure out how to tell our friends and co-workers, navigate what it meant to go from best friends to something more. But right now, in this moment, it was just us and the morning light and the beginning of something I'd been too afraid to hope for. I closed my eyes, feeling more at peace than I had in years. Sometimes the scariest questions lead to the best answers. Sometimes lying on someone's floor at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling is exactly where you need to be. And sometimes, when someone asks what you're thinking about, the bravest thing you can do is tell them the truth.